What's the one thing you would never sell, even if you were desperate? I thought I knew the answer to that question until the day my life completely shattered. My husband, Mark, didn't just walk out the door. He cleaned out our joint accounts, leaving me a handful of bills, the mortgage, and a cold note that simply read, "I'm done." We had been married 30 years, and suddenly, I was 55, alone, and completely ruined. The emotional devastation was bad enough, but the financial terror was far worse. Every morning, I woke up to the silence of the house and the screaming reality of the debt he left behind. The comfortable, safe life I thought I had built was revealed to be a fragile house of cards. And now, I was utterly alone at rock bottom. Facing foreclosure and panic. The emotional heartbreak of the divorce was overwhelming, but the cold reality of the bills was paralyzing. I was terrified to open the mailbox, knowing every envelope held another demand for money I didn't have. I started cutting everything. No more cable TV, no more lunch with friends. And I even started turning down the heat, bundling up in layers of sweaters just to save a few pennies. The shame was suffocating. I felt like a failure, and I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone how truly dire things were. I would stand in the grocery store, calculating if I could afford a loaf of bread, and putting back things like cheese or fresh vegetables because they were too expensive. I had worked hard all my life, and now, because of one selfish act by my husband, I was facing total ruin. The fear of losing the house, the only thing I had left, was a constant, sickening knot in my stomach. The day I knew I couldn't pay the electricity bill, I had to stop pretending. I looked around the house, trying to find anything jewelry, old electronics, anything that wasn't bolted down that could be turned into cash. The problem was, Mark had already taken all the valuable things, the expensive pieces he cared about. All that was left were my things, the things with sentimental value. I went up to the attic, breathing in the musty smell of forgotten time, and pulled down the dusty memory box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were dried flowers from high school dances, faded cards, and a few pieces of costume jewelry. And then, at the bottom, wrapped carefully in an old velvet cloth, was the one thing I swore I would keep forever. My father's old wristwatch. It wasn't gold, it wasn't shiny, and it hadn't worked in decades. But it was the last tangible link to the kindest man I ever knew. My stomach dropped. I realized I was desperate enough to sell the one thing that truly mattered. That old watch wasn't a piece of jewelry. It was a piece of my father. He wore it every single day of my life until the day he passed. It was a simple, sturdy metal watch with a worn leather strap, and he always used it to teach me about time, about being on time, about making time for what matters, and about how quickly time flies. The minute hand had stopped working about 20 years ago, and my dad simply refused to get it fixed. He used to laugh and say, "The our hand is all I need now, because time is just moving too fast anyway." When he passed, I put the watch in the memory box, telling myself I would get it working one day. But really, I kept it because it still held the faint, familiar scent of his aftershave and felt heavy with his history. Knowing that this broken, sentimental piece, the last tangible thing I had left of my father, might have to go to pay a cold, heartless electricity bill, was almost unbearable. I sat in the kitchen, turning that heavy, silent watch over and over in my hands. The thought of selling it felt like betrayal. It was the last piece of my father, the last warm memory in a house that was now cold and empty because of Mark's cruelty. How could I sell a piece of my soul just to keep the lights on? I wrestled with the guilt for a whole night. But then I looked at the eviction notice, and I looked at the flashing red light on the answering machine, another angry call from a creditor. The shame of losing the watch was suddenly less terrifying than the shame of losing the roof over my head. I had to eat. I had to stay warm, and I had to stop the panic. I had to be practical, the way my father always taught me to be. With a crushing, hollow feeling in my chest, I wrapped the broken watch one last time and told myself that my father would rather I be safe and fed than holding onto a sentimental broken object. It was the hardest decision I had made since the divorce. I took the bus downtown to a small, cluttered antique shop, the kind of place where things go to be forgotten. I walked in, heart pounding, and placed the heavy, silent watch on the counter. The dealer, a quick, cold man, didn't even look up at me. He gave the watch a quick, disinterested glance, noted the broken movement and the worn strap, and grunted. He offered me $50. I couldn't breathe. $50 for the last piece of my father? I managed to whisper, "Could you please make it 100? I need to pay the electricity bill." He sighed, clearly annoyed, and pulled two crisp $50 notes from the drawer. I sold my dad's broken watch for $100. The transaction took less than 30 seconds. When he slid the money over and took the watch, flipping it casually into a box behind the counter, it felt like he was throwing away a piece of my soul. I grabbed the cash and ran out of the shop, not even looking back. The money felt dirty in my hand, and the empty space on my wrist felt huge. I used the $100 immediately to pay the most pressing bills, and the lights stayed on. But the peace didn't last. Instead, a wave of profound guilt washed over me. I had kept that watch for over 20 years as a promise to my father, and I had traded it for 2 weeks of electricity. I couldn't stop thinking about the look on that dealer's cold face as he tossed the watch into a box. It wasn't just money I had lost. It was dignity, and it was a piece of my history. I walked through the house, where every item suddenly felt fragile and temporary. The emptiness was worse than before the sale. I felt like I had failed my father, failed myself, and had just resigned myself to this terrible, downward slide that Mark had started. I spent the next week barely eating, too consumed by worry and regret, believing that the broken watch was gone forever, and with it, the last bit of luck I had. The days that followed were the longest of my life. The house was cold and quiet, not just because I was saving on heat, but because the spirit of the place felt gone, sold along with the watch. I avoided looking at my left wrist, where the phantom weight of the watch still seemed to linger. Every time the phone rang, I jumped, terrified it was another collector, another piece of bad news. But the calls were just telemarketers or wrong numbers. I went through the motions, checking the mail, making small meals, feeling completely numb. I had hit rock bottom, and the silence seemed to confirm that my luck had run out, that there was no way back up. I convinced myself I was meant to face this struggle alone. I decided that I needed to stop dwelling on the broken watch and the broken marriage, and figure out my next practical step for survival. It was exactly in that moment of final, silent despair that the phone rang, and the voice on the other end was the cold, flat voice of the antique dealer. I nearly dropped the phone. It was the antique dealer, Mr. Jensen. His voice was no longer flat and cold. It was strained, almost breathless. He didn't say hello. He just said my name, followed by, "I need you to come back to the shop right now." The watch. It's not what I thought it was. My heart seized up. My first thought was dread. Maybe the watch was fake, and he wanted his $100 back. I stuttered, asking what was wrong, and his voice dropped to a low whisper. He said he had taken the broken watch to his expert watchmaker for a routine check. Before tossing it into his repair pile, he explained that the watchmaker almost laughed at the cheap, broken thing, but then he looked closer at the dial and the specific markings on the movement. He said, "Misses my name, the material, the age. This isn't just an old watch. This is something else entirely. Please don't ask questions. Just come back." I felt a dizzying surge of hope and panic. I grabbed my coat, realizing my life was about to pivot. All because of the little broken timepiece I sold for $100. I couldn't wait for the bus. I took a taxi downtown, my mind racing. On the way, I pulled out my phone and frantically searched for information about my father's watch. I remembered the watchmaker mentioning specific markings and the name of the movement. I typed the brand name and the unique serial number into the search bar. The results that popped up made the taxi nearly swerve. I saw articles and auction listings using words I never associated with my father's simple timepiece. Ultra rare, pre-war prototype, and historical significance. Suddenly, that broken, dull-looking watch was being discussed on high-end collector forums. My $100 mistake was turning into something unbelievable. The prices listed were astronomical, not hundreds, but tens of thousands, and in some cases, even more. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. I realized that the watch had a secret, a legacy that had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with the future I thought I had lost. I burst back into Mr. Jensen's shop, breathless, the simple word 3 echoing in my head from my frantic searches. Mr. Jensen looked completely different. His coldness was replaced by a strange mix of awe and terror. He led me into a back office where the watchmaker, a tiny, nervous man, stood guarding my father's timepiece under a bright lamp. Mr. Jensen sat me down and, speaking very slowly, told me the full story. The watch was one of a handful of prototypes, made for a famous European client just before the war piece of history, that had simply disappeared. He told me the watch was so rare, so historically important, that a single collector had already made an offer. I held my breath, waiting for the number. He said, "Miss is my name. The watch is guaranteed to sell at auction for no less than $3 million. I couldn't move. $3 million. The tiny, broken, unloved thing I sold for $100 was actually worth enough to change my life, pay off all the debt, and secure my future 10 times over. I felt a dizzying mix of disbelief and overwhelming relief, realizing the terrifying days of worrying about the electricity bill were instantly, miraculously over. The $3 million was unbelievable, but the watchmaker, who had been studying the piece closely, interrupted my daze. He told me that while examining the inner workings, he discovered something that had nothing to do with the monetary value, but everything to do with my father. He carefully opened the back casing of the watch, revealing a tiny, hidden inner compartment, something only master watchmakers knew about. Inside, etched microscopically into the metal, was a personal message. Not from the original manufacturer, but from my father. The message was simple, beautiful, and specific. My girl, your strength is measured not by what you hold, but by what you endure. Wait for the sun. I collapsed into the chair, tears streaming down my face. My father hadn't just given me a watch. He had hidden a final message of faith and foresight, a secret gift placed there decades ago, waiting until the exact moment I hit rock bottom to remind me that he believed in my endurance. The watch wasn't worth $3 million. It was priceless. I stared at the microscopic engraving, feeling my father's presence as clearly as if he were sitting right next to me. The message, my girl, your strength is measured not by what you hold, but by what you endure. Wait for the sun wasn't a coincidence. It was a prophecy. He knew life would be hard. He knew strength wasn't about holding onto possessions, like the watch itself, or even the marriage to Mark, but about enduring the hard times. He had somehow foreseen that I would be pushed to the very limit, forced to sell the watch, and that by letting it go, the sun, the salvation would finally come. I realized that my most painful, desperate choice, selling the watch for a meager $100, was actually the trigger for my rescue. If I hadn't been desperate enough to sell it, the secret would have remained hidden forever in my memory box. My father's foresight was protecting me, even decades after his death. I spent hours with Mr. Jensen and the watchmaker, not discussing the bidding wars or the $3 million, but focusing solely on the inscription. I asked the watchmaker if my father could have etched it himself. He said it would have required specialized tools, meaning my father went to great effort and expense to hide this message. That solidified the realization my father wasn't just giving me a watch. He was giving me a financial life preserver wrapped in an emotional time capsule. He must have known the watch was valuable, and he created the hidden compartment as a fail-safe, a final blessing for a time of ultimate need. It wasn't about the money. It was about the intention. This was his last act of protection, ensuring that even if I faced utter devastation like the betrayal I just endured, I would have a path back to safety. The crushing feeling of failure and abandonment lifted, replaced by a profound, warming sense of being utterly loved and guarded, even from beyond the grave. The lawyers and auction house took over immediately, and suddenly, the fear was gone. The bills were on hold, and my future was secure. But the very first thing I did wasn't pay off the mortgage or buy a luxury item. It was something small, but immensely powerful. I went to the best coffee shop in town, the one I had walked past hundreds of times while calculating if I could afford a loaf of bread. I sat down at a table, ordered a large, expensive cappuccino and a fresh pastry, and just savored the moment. For the first time in months, I wasn't anxious. I wasn't calculating. I wasn't budgeting. I paid the bill with a $20 note and walked out, leaving a ridiculously generous tip. It was an act of quiet, dignified rebellion against the poverty and fear Mark had left me in. I realized the money wasn't just paying bills. It was buying back my freedom, my peace of mind, and the right to enjoy a simple moment without shame or terror. The auction sale went through without a hitch, and the funds after all the proper checks and fees landed in a brand new, solo bank account. But the most satisfying moment wasn't seeing the multi-million-dollar balance. It was sitting down with the stack of bills Mark had left and finally tearing them up. I started with the eviction notice, ripping it into 100 tiny pieces and tossing it into the recycling bin with a satisfying sense of finality. Then came the phone calls. I called the power company, the credit card agencies, and the mortgage lender, informing each one that the full amount was being wired immediately. The relief was palpable. The cold, sickening knot of financial terror that had lived in my stomach for months dissolved completely. It wasn't just paying the bills. It was erasing the constant, humiliating sense of debt and dependence that Mark had imposed on me. My father's gift had truly liberated me from the prison of my husband's betrayal. It was inevitable. The sale of such a high-profile, rare watch made regional news, and of course, Mark found out. About a week after the money hit the account, he called me. I hadn't heard his voice in months, and it was sickeningly familiar, but now, it was sickly sweet. He said he was so happy for me and wanted to reconnect and celebrate. I knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted a piece of the $3 million. He started reminiscing about our marriage, suggesting that since the watch was acquired during our life together, he was entitled to a share. My blood ran cold, but this time, the fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce dignity. The woman who had been terrified to open the mail was gone. I knew this was my moment of reckoning, not just to protect my money, but to fully reclaim my power after his devastating betrayal. I agreed to meet Mark in a neutral, public place. When he walked in, he tried to hug me, offering sympathetic apology, but I held up a hand, stopping him cold. I let him talk for 5 minutes about reconnecting and the unfairness of the universe, all while pretending he was entitled to a portion of the sale. When he finally finished, I looked him straight in the eye and spoke with a calm, steady voice I didn't know I possessed. I said, "Mark, when you left, you took everything we built together and left me with nothing but debt and a broken watch. That watch was a gift from my father, acquired before I ever met you. You abandoned me in my darkest hour. The $3 million is my father's final act of love and protection for me. You are entitled to nothing. Please leave my life and never contact me again." I didn't scream, I didn't plead, and I didn't show anger. I simply stated the truth and walked away. I realized that my triumph wasn't about the money. It was about having the self-respect to refuse him, choosing dignity over revenge. With the emotional baggage shed and the financial fear gone, I finally started living. The vast fortune was a tool, not a trophy. I kept my home now debt-free and warm, but I used the rest to do something meaningful. I started a small foundation in my father's memory, providing microloans and grants to women over 50 who, like me, had been blindsided by divorce or financial devastation. I finally had a true purpose, helping others regain the dignity and safety Mark had tried to strip from me. I traveled a little, learned new skills, and most importantly, I surrounded myself with people who genuinely cared. I was no longer a victim. I was a benefactor, a survivor, and an advocate. The watch didn't just save my bank account. It gave me a second chance at a life that was honest, fulfilling, and completely my own. Today, I look at the small picture I keep of my father, and I feel nothing but gratitude. That broken watch, the one I sold for $100 out of sheer desperation, taught me the most important lesson of my life. It wasn't the $3 million that saved me. The money was just the mechanism. What saved me was my father's foresight and the enduring message he left. Your strength is measured, not by what you hold, but by what you endure. I endured the betrayal, the shame, and the rock bottom, and in doing so, I proved to myself that my worth was intrinsic. It couldn't be taken away by a selfish husband, and it couldn't be bought with money. I learned that even the things that seem broken and discarded, whether it's an old family heirloom or a life that feels shattered, can hold the most incredible value and the key to your future. I lost everything, but in the end, I found more than just a fortune. I found my dignity, my purpose, and the unshakable peace that comes from knowing you are deeply and eternally loved.